I'm joined here by Rich Lowrie, who, when he isn't advising Herman Cain on his economic policy, he's an investment advisor in suburban Cleveland with a degree in accounting. First of all, welcome to Bloomberg. Appreciate the time. And how did someone like you, with your background, you're not a classically trained economist, a PhD like some of the other candidates have. How'd you get involved with this campaign, and are you qualified to be advising potentially the next president of the United States?
Well, I learned economics early in my career and consider my mentors to be Art Laffer, Jude Winniski, Chuck Cadlick, Rich Vedder, a number of well-known economists. To the charge that I don't have a PhD, I just simply respond and say that if I held a bowling ball over your foot and let go, neither one of us need a PhD to know what would happen. So we're going to focus on the simple truths, that production drives the economy, risk-taking drives growth, and measurements have to be dependable. A dollar has to retain its value the same way an hour is always 60 minutes. I don't have to know everything. I just have to know who to talk to, to get answers.
Well, the simplicity of 999 certainly has shown its appeal early on, but let me talk to you about some of the criticism that we're hearing. You've heard it all from the Republican candidates who are running against Mr. Cain. First of all, from some conservatives, you're adding a national sales tax. The only thing worse than the current tax code is adding another tax on top of it. How do you respond to that?
Well, first, we're not adding a tax on top of it. What we do is we pull out the corporate income tax, we pull out the personal income tax, all payroll taxes, employer and employee sides of that, the capital gains tax, and the death tax. So when you pull those taxes out and you put in a more lean and efficient tax code, we're actually reducing the overall size of the tax wedge by about 15 percentage points. So central to the understanding of the sales tax is that it won't raise prices, it will raise visibility. So a bottle of water, let's say, instead of costing $1, will cost 90 cents plus a 9% sales tax. What people don't understand that should is that you're already paying those consumption taxes. They're just not called consumption taxes. The farmer passes along their tax to the food processor, to the distributor, to the grocery store. So by the time you buy anything, all those taxes are already embedded. We're pulling out embedded taxes and we're making them visible.
The criticism on the other side, somehow the poor, middle-income Americans are going to be hurt most by this. I know you all have pushed back that there's a carve-out for the poor. Explain to me how.
Well, before we came up with the 9% rates, we did a substantial carve-out that we call the poverty exemption. We released the full amount of that and made it known well in advance that we were going to use every penny of it. We just asked that we be allowed to roll out the opportunity zones first so that we can detail that. 999, and this is using Jack Kemp's style of opportunity zones, not President Clinton's. 999 just made the whole country one large opportunity zone, so the whole country will get an exemption to the poverty level based on family size, so that 999 kicks in at income on the first dollar above the poverty exemption, and that only uses 1/3 of the total amount of carve-out we have. So we still have 2/3 that we plan on putting to full use. Part will be toward business incentives for hiring, and the remainder is going to be for specific geographic opportunity zones.
We're going to continue our conversation afterwards here, but really quickly, the controversy of the last few days. I know it's not your department with the campaign. How big of a blow is this to the campaign? Is this something that Herman Cain and his campaign can overcome?
They're dealing with it now. I think they're going to be able to overcome it. I'm going to stick with economics, and it's not going to have an impact on the economic policy.
Let me ask you about the opportunity zones, the empowerment zones that you've talked about. How will this work? Because you said there's a carve-out already for those people who are, again, below the poverty line, but also there may be certain areas of the country that are particularly hard hit that may get more of a break, if you will, under this plan. Explain to me how that works and how will you pick between certain localities versus others?
Well, there are two different zones. One is the entire U.S. is now one large opportunity zone, so there is the across-the-board exemption for income up to the poverty level. We will also apply business incentives against payroll to encourage additional hiring, and by starting that from kind of the bottom up, that's going to provide more of an incentive for the lower skill, lower wage jobs. The higher skill, higher wage jobs actually has a pretty low unemployment rate relative to the rest of the country. And then the last roughly 1/3 are going to be applied toward specific geographic areas. And what we're doing there is we're setting up a competition and say, if you recognize the own barriers and obstacles that are largely self-imposed, that are put in at the local level and the state level. And if you're serious about reducing those, then you'll be awarded a designation that would be additional tax incentives. So we're relying on a bottom-up identification of what the problems are. What do the local entrepreneurs say? If they say, hey, this is what's holding us back, this is what's holding us back, if we could just do this and this, I could expand my business and hire more people. And if they're serious about working together to knock down those barriers, it's going to be a competitive process. So areas that have concentrations of poverty, that say we're not going to get serious knocking down our own barriers, we want to continue with more of the same, are not likely to get the designation and additional tax incentives.
You had some pushback at the AEI conference yesterday on this issue. Some people suggested you could live in one street in America and then a few streets over and be poor, for example, and live a few streets over and perhaps get different treatment, and there were questions about that. Again, is that a reasonable scenario?
It could, but keep in mind that most of the incentives that we have carved out are for the whole country. You know, if you look at the total size of the exemption, again, there's a across-the-board exemption for income for everybody. There will be across-the-board business incentives for hiring. That's going to be every street in America. It will only be the concentrations of poverty that would be eligible. There's certain criteria in terms of, you know, joblessness, you know, poverty rates that will be part of the determination. And there is also an incentive to cover as large of an area as possible. So what I would say is, you know, if you're on, you know, one side of the street, join with the local stakeholder groups and try to get the zone as big as possible. I mean, we're serious about attacking the problem, and you want competition among zones, and you want each zone to be as big as possible and cover as much population as possible.
Herman Cain said this week here in Washington, he's said even on the website, that ultimately he'd like to go to the fair tax, ultimately, a national consumption tax, if you will. Why not make that transition right away? Why not cut to the chase? Why are you offering $9.99 in the interim?
Well, I think what the fair tax, the flat tax, and $9.99 have in common is that you tax a broader base at a lower rate. You get simplicity, you get efficiency. Depending on how they're structured, you may get neutrality. But the one thing the fair tax has that the other plans do not have is full and complete transparency. You see every time you buy something exactly what government is costing you. The 999 plan is a step in that direction. We feel as though we need to introduce the 999 to get the fair taxers and the flat taxers from pulling against each other, and give them a way to join forces and get behind something, so that once this passes, we can prove that the 9% sales tax is not going to raise prices. And when the country sees that it won't, and they see the kind of economic activity you have by shifting some of the burden away from production toward consumption, then I think the country is going to be ready for it. Right now, despite the fact that you have very strong support of a fair tax, it is nowhere near the level that is necessary in order to go right to a fair tax. So this will be a transition plan that stays in place as long as it has to, in order to get the support necessary to take the next step.
One final question for you. Do your clients back in Ohio know what you're doing right now?
They do now. You know, we were drafting a letter to notify clients that I would be splitting my time with the campaign, that we put in place solutions to deal with the client service side of the business, and then the national spotlight, you know, caught up with me. And I regret that I wasn't able to inform them personally, and they had to hear about it through all the news coverage. But you know, we have plans in place now. I have help from the campaign, so that I have, you know, some of my time is more manageable, and I certainly have help from a team that is able to make sure that we're still able to deliver for clients.
Rich Lowrie, thanks for the time. Appreciate you joining us here
Peter.
on Bloomberg.
My pleasure.